Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening to have this very interesting panel discussion with faculty from the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University. I'm going to quickly hand it over to Vinay. But before I hand it over, just a couple of things. If you have any questions or comments, you can put it in the live chat box on YouTube, and we'll try to take some of those questions towards the end of the discussion. If you have any other queries, you can put it down and we'll try to address them in the chat, or we'll get back to you over email. Over to you, Vinay.
Thanks, Pratiti. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this conversation about the Humanities program at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. We, the faculty of School of Arts and Science, are very excited to tell all of you young students and their parents to what it means to be a BA art student. Bachelor's of Arts student at Azim Premji University. Before I go any further, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Vinay Kumar. I teach in the English group at Azim Premji University School of Arts and Sciences, Bangalore. And with me are my colleagues from the Humanities group. Could I ask Tarun to please introduce himself to the audience?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tarun. I am part of the philosophy group at Azim University, and I teach in the PPE major, which is the philosophy, politics, and economics major. I teach a variety of different subjects. I teach the introductory course, which combines the three disciplines: philosophy, politics, science, political science, and economics. I also teach a lot of courses on political philosophy, on the philosophy of science, and also the philosophy of art.
Thanks, Tarun. Samira, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Samira. I am part of the history group at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. My own area of specialization is early modern history and the history of religions in South Asia. I teach courses on the early modern period, on Indian Ocean worlds. I also teach courses that are part of the common curriculum here at Azim Premji University.
Thanks, Samira. Shalini, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shalini. I'm with the English group. I teach a lot of courses in the BA English curriculum. Among others, I teach a couple of creative writing courses. I also teach other things in English and also in the common curriculum. So, yeah.
Thanks, Shalini. Thanks, everybody. So before we get into the meat of our conversation, I thought we'd start on a lighter note today. And I was wondering a quick question on how did you end up taking the humanities as a question? And I thought, since I'm going to put you through this, I'll start about myself. I did sciences up until the 12th standard, and it was a hard sell for my parents to switch to the humanities because there's this whole misconception of, it's not the field for making money, it's not a career advancement field. And I had to sell it off as, see, it's what I'm interested in, it's what I'm passionate about, it's what I'm good at. And success is found only when you're good at something or when you're part of a larger conversation. Well, it was a hard sell. It was a sell they saw through when they saw that I could make something out of myself, and I had to make a presentation of sorts to them and sell it, and it worked. And I think it's also true for many of my colleagues who did science up to the 12th and then they switched to the humanities later in the undergrad. So would anybody want to volunteer and share how you ended up here in the humanities?
Well, I actually did science in the 11th and 12th also. And I did it because I wanted to do the humanities. And my parents said, keep your options open. And I said, oh, all right, fine. So I did science. And I was so miserable for those 2 years that at the end of it, my parents said, you know what, do whatever you want. And then, but then the college I applied to said, look, but you've done science, you've done quite well. Why are you applying for arts? And I said, no, look, please let me do arts. And I almost wept at the principal, and then they let me do arts. So, yeah.
Fun. Samira, Tarun?
Okay, I'll go next. So I very happily took up the humanities, and I had a forerunner in the family who also did the humanities, but we did carry with us the burden of trying to prove that this is not a flaky choice on our part, and we did that by doing economics and maths as part of the humanities sort of cluster of subjects. And the idea was, again, to keep your options open in the future so that you have choices. And I think when I finished school, I thought I was going to be an economist, and then I became a historian. But I didn't have to fight off my parents, though they did look at me like, there she goes, one more kid who doesn't want to make money. but the choice worked out, and I think even for the parents, they were fine with it.
So I actually did science for a bit longer than Vinay and Shalini. I have my undergraduate degree in physics, and fortunately or unfortunately, I guess depending on who you ask, the college I went to allowed you to take classes in the humanities while you were doing your physics degree. And so I took some philosophy classes while I was doing the physics degree, and I fell in love with the subject and decided to then do a PhD in philosophy afterwards. And a lot of people think it's a big switch moving from physics to philosophy, but I think of that as being a kind of continuity. And I've always been interested in kind of fundamental questions about how the world works. And I feel like that's what I'm doing as a philosopher, just as that's what I was trying to do when I was studying physics.
Well, I mean, I think all of our trajectories have been very interesting and how we arrived at the humanities, right? Because I think it was at the end a core idea of what we thought we wanted to pursue as a passion. Because in the way the world's changing right now, it's also important to study something that we're good at and something that would be of interest rather than following a herd. So I think taking off on that note, should we talk? I'd like to hear your thoughts on what, or share with our students and parents what they'd actually study in their respective majors. What does it? What do they actually study when they do a BA in English or history or philosophy? So, would Samira want to start off with what they do in a history BA?
Okay, I'll go first. So in a history BA, I mean, one of the things that happens at our university is that all the students take up a bunch of courses which are not really in their discipline. So you have a whole host of courses, what we call the common curriculum that both of us mentioned earlier. So we teach courses in that, students take it, we teach it. That's one. Then in the history, as part of a history BA degree, a major, if you are majoring in history, then you have a bunch of courses on Indian history and on world history. That's the easiest way to kind of characterize them. And within those courses, what we study is you get a sense of what is the scholarship on the subject. The key thing that we keep trying to point out to our students is that, as given that this is a degree in higher education, there's not more history, but history at a higher degree. You're also interested in figuring out how do we know the things that we know about the past. How do we interpret the past? Why do we have multiple people saying something on the same question? Why are certain debates recurring debates in history? So we are giving them content, as it were, but very much framed within a kind of a conversation about how the discipline actually works. What are the methods of history? What are the big debates in history? What are the big historiographical shifts that have taken place over time? And what do we even mean by historiography? That is the writing of history and the study of the writing of history. And what kind of shifts have taken place over time, so that students understand that this is a subject which is really dynamic, really, really dynamic. I can't emphasize that enough, in fact. And they get a taste for that kind of dynamism of the discipline, and unlearn an idea of history that they came into college with, which is that you're going to be learning a bunch of facts. So that's kind of what the course is structured as. So a bunch of courses on Indian history, on world history. Within that, we discuss these things, and there are of course electives as well that various faculty offer based on what their research interests are. So, for instance, next semester, I'll be teaching an elective on the history of performance practices in South Asia and how they've been growing and evolving in different contexts in different ways. And so there are a whole variety of such elective courses that our faculty, given their areas of specialization, they offer to students. I don't know if this is the right time to talk about a minor in history. So, you could be getting into a program in, let's say, English, that's your major, but you're minoring in history. Then, for one of the minors that we are about to launch in history is on archaeology. A kind of bespoke set of courses which pertain to archaeology. And there, I mentioned English as as a major discipline, and perhaps history as the minor. But we're also hoping for students from the sciences to take up archaeology as a minor. We very recently had a student who graduated from history, and she's now going to apply to a PhD program in archaeobotany. Right? It is a transition, but the fact is that these are the kinds of avenues that open up in these fields. So this is what we do in history at ABU.
Thanks, Samira. And since you also opened the conversation about minors, Tarun, would you want to talk about the PPE major and the philosophy minor?
Yeah, so the PPE major, which again I remind you is philosophy, politics, and economics, it's a multidisciplinary major, as the name suggests, which means that you'll be taking classes in all of these three disciplines. You'll be taking some of the classes that economics majors take, some of the classes that social science majors take, and then you'll be taking a lot of philosophy classes as part of the major, and there are some classes that try to combine the three disciplines. So they're PPE specific classes. Um, uh, in addition to that, there's also a philosophy minor, and the philosophy minor doesn't overlap at all with with the philosophy classes you take as a PPE major. So, if you're interested in, say, doing philosophy as a major, while we don't have a BA philosophy course specifically, if you took a PPE minor and a PPE major and a philosophy minor, you'd effectively have around the same number of philosophy courses that you would have otherwise in an undergraduate philosophy degree. So that combination is possible if you're particularly interested in philosophy. But of course, the philosophy minor we like to think is something that people from any discipline could potentially be interested in and benefit from. And a part of that is because of the way we think about philosophy in our program, in the PP program and in the minor, is unlike many other universities where the idea of studying philosophy is studying about philosophers. That's not the approach we have. The approach we have is that the idea of studying philosophy is to be a philosopher, to become a philosopher. So the idea is to really focus on problem solving, thinking creatively, asking bold questions, rather than learning specifically, what some philosopher has said at some particular time. You learn a little bit of that, but that's really not the emphasis. And so, because of that, our classes tend not to be focused on particular historical traditions of philosophy. They tend to be focused more on applying the tools of philosophy, like I said, asking bold questions, thinking through things systematically to various domains. So, we have classes in the philosophy of science, we have classes on political philosophy, we have classes on the philosophy of language, the philosophy of art, a variety of classes like that. So the idea is to think of philosophy as a set of tools that are not domain specific, that can be applied to an analysis of a wide range of subjects. And that's what you'll be getting in both the PPE major and the philosophy minor. Of course, in the PPE major, in addition to that, you'll also be studying some basic ideas of economics and getting acquainted with Indian society, its political and social structure.
Thanks, Tarun. That was extremely informative, and I think I hope most students pick up the PPE major and the philosophy minor. Shalini, would you want to introduce our audience to the English major and the English minor?
Yeah. So I suppose when you're thinking of how we study literature in APU, there's sort of two ways we come at the idea of literature. One is the question of what is this object called literature that we're studying, right? So in which case we're thinking of different kinds of textual forms, which many of you are probably familiar with, right? So you'd be reading poetry, you'd be reading drama, you read novels, that kind of thing. Essays, lots of them. So one way of thinking about what you study in a literature class is thinking in terms of the forms. The other way of thinking about what you might study in a literature class would be thinking in terms of the kinds of contexts that produce these forms. So you might be thinking of literary periods that that produce certain kinds of writing, that produce certain kinds of literature. You might be thinking of variations in form. So, for instance, for instance, you might study a course where you just do drama for one semester. But you might also do a course like poetry from South Asia, where you will be studying a bunch of different kinds of poetry that emerge in South Asia in a particular kind of time period. Right, and for something like that, you'll really be paying attention to the kinds of the social world we inhabit, the cultural world we inhabit, and how they are producing all of these poems. Taking a longer view, I think what you would end up studying over your 4 years is there's a lot of reading. There is also a lot of writing, which is when you are studying a literary text. A lot of how you think through it, how you analyze it, and how you interpret it needs to happen via writing. So our program is quite heavily focused on writing. And it's also quite heavily focused on the different ways in which you would analyze these literary texts. How would you approach them? How would you break them down? How would you take them apart and examine them? Right? That's really the kind of thing you will end up doing a lot of in a English degree.
Thanks, Shalini. For the next question, I think while I'd want Tarun to respond first, it's also, I think, a question I'd like everybody else to think about while he answers, because, okay, I'll go for the question first. How do the disciplines prepare students to navigate the world today, which is so fast changing, especially with technology, politics, and everybody's most important and worrisome topic, the AI, artificial intelligence? Tarun, since you also use some of them in your courses and you've set a path for all of us to think innovatively with I think you should really take the lead on this question.
Okay, I don't know if I'm fully qualified to have a full answer for this, but I'll attempt to at least say a little bit about how I think about it. Um, so I think one thing to keep in mind is that now that we're in a world where at least it seems like one possible trajectory is going to be an expansion of the role that AI is going to play in our work lives, I think that makes the humanities all the more important, right? And partly because the idea of humanity all the more important, right? Articulating quite clearly where it is that we cannot abandon a sense of humanness, a sense of what it means to be fundamentally the kinds of beings we are, participating in the kinds of social activities that we are participating in. I think we need to be very clear about that. And I think part of what the humanities tries to do collectively is try to define that, to define what it means to be human, what the breadth of human capacity, breadth of human thought achievement is meant to be. And so I think one very important aspect, just from a broad perspective, of what we hope to do in philosophy, and I'm sure happens in English and history as well, is producing a sense of being able to think in a way about the world that can't just be offloaded onto an artificial system, right? Not think in this purely instrumental way where you're just looking for an answer to a question you have, but thinking in a kind of way that is open, that is looking for horizons that you haven't yet encountered and trying to accommodate those. And those are the kinds of questions at which AI, at least the way it currently is not good, right? AI might be able to give you very good answers if you ask it a straight question, and then it can just pull a particular factual answer for it. But the humanities argues that what it means to think about the world from humanistic perspective is much broader than that. I think that is one thing that we try to emphasize in philosophy. And like you mentioned, I use artificial intelligence in my classes. I think, and even though there are serious worries I have about the technology, I also think it's not something that we should be turning away from. It's going to become a large part of our lives. But I use it partly in order to illustrate the kind of boundary between what aspects of our thought and life can perhaps be done with this system and what aspects really cannot, right? To articulate what it means to have a fundamental room for humanity. And I worry that a lot of the discussion about AI is just about, uh, humans are necessary because AI sometimes gets things wrong. But that's not the right answer, right? Eventually, AI is not going to get things wrong, perhaps. But human inquiry, human understanding of the world is still going to be necessary because it's a fundamentally different kind of understanding, an understanding that is imbued with our social nature, right? The fact that we try to engage with each other, try to understand each other, that's not something you get from AI. So that's kind of our broad approach.
Thanks, Tarun. That was a very interesting answer. And would Samira want to go next?
I almost feel like the conversation around humanities and the AI is the topic of a whole other webinar that we need to have. But I think it's not just about AI. I guess there's lots going on around us. Technology being one part of that. As you mentioned, politics is another aspect. And I think as a historian, especially when I'm talking to young students who are thinking about history, and also the parents of students who are thinking about history, I think one thing is that, the kinds of skills that Tarun is mentioning in terms of how we think, what makes us human, and then the nature of our thinking process. is it cannot be emphasized enough. But the other aspect is that I think there is this tendency amongst us to sometimes be like, well, what good is history, for instance? Like, things have happened before. When have we ever learned from our past? And we commit the same mistakes again. And oftentimes, first year students, when you ask them what is the benefit of studying history, they will say that, well, it helps us understand what happened in the past so we don't make these mistakes again. And as we when we look around us in our society today, we know that we make the same mistakes again. We're not able to not make those mistakes, but we do understand, I think, patterns better. What happens when radically new technology enters the social sphere, how it is utilized, by whom it is utilized, what does it make possible, what does it prevent from happening. The fact that technology does not kind of exist in a vacuum, but is very much embedded within a social context with all of its, let's say, inequalities of access, informing what the technology can and cannot do. And so we need to be aware of that social context in which technology operates and has done so in the past. So that's the lesson that history would teach you, that something like the printing press, for instance, was considered a revolutionary technology in terms of the dissemination of information, and the consolidation of knowledge systems, etc. And now we know, looking back, we do understand how these things tend to pan out, right? It's not that there is an exact similarity between what has happened in the past and what is taking place today, but we have studied them closely enough to understand that we can expect certain patterns to unfold. That also gives, in fact, even if you are not a humanities student or a humanities researcher and you are from the sciences, this research actually helps you ask the kind of questions that need to be asked about how should we develop the technology looking ahead. So the humanities have a really important role to play also in determining what directions technology ought to take in the future. So this is the way I think about it. I also think that, again, from the perspective of a high school student, not just PhDs in history or philosophy or the sciences, that there is often a kind of either or sort of understanding of the sciences and the humanities, right? As if they are polar opposites, have nothing to do with each other. You opt one and then you forget about the other. Is definitely not the case. I think the higher levels of research in any discipline will show you how closely tied the humanities and the sciences in fact are. And that higher level research underwrites the curriculum for an undergraduate degree. That close relationship between the sciences and humanities informs what you will learn in the classroom. That's important to know. And I think that the worry that we have, that we might be left behind if we don't master coding, and suddenly you find that AI can do the coding, so you are being left behind, as it were. But if you had picked up another bunch of soft skills, as we call them, that the humanities are famous for, maybe we would have been able to negotiate this change better. Point being that I think it would be premature. This is an ongoing conversation. It's premature to think that the humanities have had their day. They definitely have not. And I think the more complex technology becomes, I think humanities will have an even bigger role to play actually in shaping that technology.
Thanks, Amira. Shalini, over to you.
Uh, so, so I think one of the things that often happens when I meet a first year class for the first time, and I sort of ask them very generally, right? Why are you here? Why are you here to study English or humanities? And but every year I get more or less the same answers, which is the students are there because they want to express themselves and because they want to communicate. And to me, that's really the core of why so many of us continue to do the humanities, even if it is, at risk of being obsolete, etc., etc. And as students progress, what they really find a lot of joy in is that ability to take imaginative leaps, right? Informed imaginative leaps. They take things they already know and they start making little leaps, start making inferences. They get very playful with the language. Again, something that the human the human mind enjoys this playing with language. One of the both the funniest and the most mortifying things, and it happens to me at least once a semester, is that someone in class will come up with a word that I have never heard before. Not so long ago, it was the word "riz," and I said, "What's that? That's not a word." And they said, "No, it really is a word." And I said, "Okay, explain it." And total silence, because the whole class thought, of course, I should figure this out from context. I tell them to figure out infer meanings of words. Why can I not do this task? So we sort of looked at each other for a bit, and then finally I looked it up. But yeah, it was a terrible moment for me. But I think really this is what we do when we think of language as something intimate, something playful, something imaginative, something we live with. And for me, I think this is really why so many of us work in the humanities and want to study it. So.
Thanks, Shalini. And I think for me, when I came into an undergrad class and we had Origin of Species by Charles Darwin as a text to read, was also a moment of, okay, so sciences in lit, how did this end up? Did I not get away from the sciences for it? So I think it's also important to realize that there is no exclusivity in these disciplines, like Samira crafted very well when she said, as you go higher up in education, they all start seeming very aligned and together. And on that note, I'd also like us to move to the next part of our conversation about careers, about life skills beyond college or beyond university. Where are they headed? So, what are the kinds of skills students develop that one, an employer actually values? And two, if you could also sprinkle it with examples of what are the unconventional paths our students have taken right after their respective undergrads. Would Shalini or Tarun want to take a dig at this first?
Yeah, I guess. I think in some ways, there's a lot of different kinds of careers our students end up doing, actually. There are careers that we anticipate, for instance, like in education. So I think a lot of BA English students do end up in the educational space, and in different parts of they teach often at primary school level, they do tutoring, they prepare materials, they work with NGOs. So education is a space that I think in some ways our program does to a certain extent anticipate that they'll do this. And of course, this is a lot of the skills they learn, right? Familiarity with literature, the ability to communicate it, the ability to teach people to appreciate it. That's the kind of thing that plays into these careers. But we also sometimes end up with students who do surprising things that we didn't anticipate, but that are in fact very literary. So we've had students work in bookstores, for instance, where they work curating book lists. They write essays, they write reviews, right? So really, they're taking a lot of the kinds of things they're learning in the classroom and translating them into their work. We also have a lot of students who take up sort of writing, editing related jobs, which of course is something that, something that they get a fair amount of training for. Right? Both reading critically, writing analytically, and so on. And in a lot of our courses, there is a focus on writing as craft. I think pretty much everyone in this conversation has spent an enormous amount of time sort of editing a student submission, saying, check, figure out how you're organizing this thing. And you need to reorder it for it to make sense, often at the sentence level, and so on. So I think these are skills that really do translate to quite a large variety of jobs. But Tarun?
In some sense, we don't have a record of what students have already, the kinds of jobs they've gone into from the PPE major, because the PPE major is fairly new. We currently only have students up to the second year. So we haven't yet graduated our first class. But the major has been constructed with the vision that students will have a wide variety of options they can go into. And in some sense, that's part of the nature of a multidisciplinary degree, right? To give you a kind of breadth that allows you a wide variety of options. The discipline that I specifically teach, philosophy, I think we think of our contribution to students as being more in terms of developing certain skills that are widely transferable. So these are skills of reading and writing, like Shalini said, reading, being able to read critically, write effectively, communicate effectively, think systematically. And these are skills that can apply across a variety of careers, but then when combined with a background in economics, policy, I think it give students, I mean, the most obvious career options for students would be to work something related to the policy or social space. It also opens up the possibility of students wanting to go into things like, policy making, international relations, law perhaps, but also things like media, journalism, also potentially teaching, right? I mean, the variety of fields where skill in analysis combined with a kind of understanding of the social fabric of the country, combined with some kind of technical analysis of how the economic system works. That combination of skills, I think, has a wide variety of options open for students. Our hope is that there'll be many students who'd be interested in going on to areas where they would use the skills they develop to contribute to the social fabric of this country in ways that are productive. But there's a variety of ways people can do that, right? You can, I mean, the obvious things are to work for an NGO or something, but even to work in journalism, to work in law, to work as a teacher, all of these are contributions that we believe someone with a PPE degree would be able to make. And we're hoping once our first batch graduates 2 years from now, we will see a lot of contributions of that kind. Yeah.
Thanks, Tarun. Samira?
Um, okay, how do I want to approach this question? I'm not sure how much more what is new about what I'm going to add to what Shalini and Tarun have already mentioned, but I think maybe I can summarize a little bit and emphasize something, which is that the kind of skills that the humanities give you are the kind of skills that have very broad applications. So this the ability to communicate such that your point is actually made is sort of put across, right? And people understand what you're saying is something that it's not just a humanities thing. The science is needed as well to be able to write such that your research makes sense to a wider public, right? So, you often have humanity students who have been trained in the humanities who do the work of actually publicizing research, putting out scientific research into the public domain so that lay people like us can understand what the scientist is actually saying. So and what I mean to say by that is that communication as a skill has to be understood therefore in a broader kind of sense. Similarly, what critical thinking is, there are certain ways in which a philosophy degree trains you to think. There are certain ways in which an English degree trains you to think, and same for history. One of the things that we think is really important about how we study history at APU, for instance, is that you develop a historical sensibility, right? What does that mean? And what is its significance in the present context, right? And what is its significance given what might be your professional choice? So let's say you want to work as a lawyer. Now people might, I mean, it's not as if corporate law is the only kind of law you can practice, right? There is law related to environmental issues, there's laws related to women's issues. Now, any and all of these are complex social kind of issues which have deep pasts. And a degree in history or a degree in the humanities actually helps you understand this field into which you're entering as a professional, right? Before you even get to studying what the law says or doesn't say. So that you as a lawyer, for instance, let's say you work in the family, in the world of family law, right? Not only do you understand the law and its application, you also understand what are the blind spots, right? Where is legislation required, or how did this legislation come into being? What is the history of law in modern India, right? How was family law even defined in the first place? And to know that is then to understand what are the long-standing challenges as a lawyer who's trying to do right by women, let's say, or other kinds of gender minorities in the country, because you have this kind of broader understanding of what these fields are. So I think, and I have to say this, not just students at APU and what they might, the kind of professions that they might have gone into. Again, I have been here for 3 years, and that's how far my institutional memory goes. And I'm sure there is a longer past of students doing very interesting things. But I myself I have an undergraduate degree in history, and I was in a class of 60 people who did history as their undergraduate degree. Only 4 of them became historians, professionally. Where did all the others go? They are not sitting jobless, in some part of the world. They actually transitioned to various different kinds of jobs. You're starting from media and journalism, and then going into an MBA after working in journalism, and now you're sitting and handling communications in Meta, right? And these kinds of trajectories you see a lot in the humanities, where people have started in one place, developed a bunch of skills, and then taken those skills because they are so imminently transferable and moved, laterally into new spaces. And so there is really nothing that you can't do, I would say, right? Uh, Everything is up for grabs.
Thanks, Samira. I think I'll also just quickly add a couple of examples or things that our students have done, at least in the BA English, since we have some record for the last 2 years of the graduating batches. They either end up doing a master's, which is a good chunk of them. Many of them take a gap year where they're either working, some have ended up at an advertising agency, some have ended up at communications. We even have a student who ended up becoming a freelance journalist, grabbing a grant and working on documenting the city. And all of these skills are something they acquire through the program in various capacities. There are also students who ended up as video editors. Might not be a skill they directly picked up at the course, but the sensibility to appreciate it is something they picked up here, right? Watching films, discussing them, looking at visual text are also things that they do across the majors. So its application might not be most obvious in the program, but just picking up these skills that open up a whole new world of interest for you is an easy possibility. I mean, if somebody spends some time just looking at the various clubs they have on campus and the activities they do, and sometimes they have no connection with the program they're studying itself. So I think the opportunity is endless when the imagination is taking the steering wheel, I think. Uh, on that note, I think I have a quick question for all of you. Should we do a lighter question before we move on to the next section, or do you just want to move into busting myths about our respective disciplines?
You're the boss.
Okay, we'll save the fun questions for the end and let's move into busting myths, I guess, about the discipline. Why don't you guys tell us one myth that you had to bust in your classroom at some point about the major, or at one conversation with somebody young who's trying to get into the discipline? Volunteers? I feel like I'm back in class and waiting for that empty class. Oh,
I'll go
yes.
first.
Samira is
I
that
think-
student.
I am that student. With apologies to my teachers in previous years. I think history, perhaps of the 3 disciplines that we're discussing here, is the most enigmatic at some level, because it has, even the students who take the subject often come with a sense of hopelessness about job prospects. It's very odd, actually. They take it, I think a lot of them actually come in thinking about the civil service exams as a prospect, which is definitely there, right? And the part of that hopelessness comes from the understanding of what history actually does, or what they're going to be doing in the next couple of years. And there's a twofold problem here. One is they think it's all about memorizing facts and dates and who did what, when, where, etc. And that is an outcome of the fact that school level education is often driven by textbooks, in which students understand that their job is to internalize what the textbook says, not question what the textbook says. And the other thing is that it's also driven by exams, where the format of the exam is often that you have to memorize things and then regurgitate them when the exam comes along. Our assessment system at Azim Premji University is completely different. We do not expect students to memorize things. We want them, in fact, to understand that if you really understood what you were reading, you will remember what it said. And the degree of depth and detail with which you need to remember something is always determined by the context you are in. If you're writing an essay on a given topic, sure, you might need to memorize a few things. But after that, you don't need to. But you will have come away with some sense of how your thinking has changed on a given topic because of what you read. And that's what we're really after, developing a set of skills in thinking, in reflecting. And that's not putting so much pressure on your brain, because otherwise we're asking the brain to remember all kinds of facts and figures which it has zero utilization for. Right? The brain doesn't want to remember these things, so it won't. And then we struggle, and then we think that this is what the discipline is, but it is not that. Right? So that's, I think, the one of the big myths, that it's about memorizing stuff. It is not. And the other thing I think I want to say has to do with the whole argument that we learn from history. We learn not to make the same mistakes a second time round. And this is a sad myth to have to bust, because I wish we learned from our mistakes, but we really don't, right? And I think that itself says something about the complexity of human society. Why is it that we go down these same sort of loops again and again and again, right? What is different this time round? Why is it happening again? And I think that makes the question all the more interesting then. Rather than looking for the solution, you try to understand the problem better, actually, and then maybe find a solution.
Thanks, Amira. Next volunteer. Tarun?
Okay, I can go, I guess. At one level, many students don't, when they come in to a philosophy degree, they don't have any particular myths in mind because they don't even know what philosophy really is. I mean, philosophy is a subject which students don't study in high school, and they often have just the vaguest kind of idea about what it is. So maybe if you can think of it as a myth that you have a complete lack of understanding of what the subject is, that's something that we have to deal with. But if there is a kind of misunderstanding that's common, it's that the bulk of philosophy, or the main thrust of philosophy, is kind of metaphysical speculation about things outside the domain of our experience, things like religion, spirituality, and so on. And certainly that is a part of philosophy. There's philosophical thinking about spirituality, about metaphysics, about religion, but that is certainly not what all philosophy is about, and certainly not what most of the philosophy that we teach in our university is about. Like I mentioned, in our program, we emphasize the idea of philosophy as a set of skills rather than the study of a particular domain. Right? It's not the study of what goes beyond experience or what can only be approached through pure thought or something like this. It's a way of asking questions, trying to examine the fundamental assumptions of an area of inquiry. And that means you can, in a sense, apply philosophical analysis to a wide variety of questions, many of which are extremely concrete, are not abstract or metaphysical at all. You can have a philosophy of sports. You can think about, okay, why does sports play the role it does in our country, in the world, in what is it that explains the fact that it's able to kind of latch on to people's emotions in such a vital way, seemingly, right? These are kinds of questions you can ask. You can ask questions in the philosophy of science, which is the area that I specialize in, right? Where you're looking specifically at particular scientific problems, scientific theories, and asking about, okay, how does this inform our understanding of the world at a more philosophical level? Right? How do our theories of physics or biology, what do they tell us about the world around us or about the nature of humanity? Right? These are not abstract metaphysical questions. These are questions that are concrete, grounded in trying to understand the world around us the way we see it, and then try to probe a little bit deeper and say, okay, what are some questions we might not usually ask about this particular concrete phenomenon that might be interesting to us, that might give us a deeper understanding. So that's maybe a major myth related to philosophy.
Shalini?
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of these, I think, easy assumptions about English, but the one that I come across a lot is the confusion between language and literature, which is very pronounced, I think, for a lot of people who come from the school system, which typically tests you on both, maybe neither, somewhere in between. So a lot of students come into the first year saying either, look, I'm very comfortable with the language, therefore I must be good at literature, or the other way around, which is I'm not very comfortable with the language, therefore I'm terrified of literature and I must be bad at it. But in fact, those things there's a certain relationship, which is if you are comfortable with the language, it's probably easier for you to read complex texts. But that's really all it is, right? All of the other literary skills, which is to say, reading critically, reading analytically, reading carefully, reading closely, all of those are skills they're skills. They're things that students build, develop, practice over the years. And they are only just a very small degree, I think, dependent on language. So I think that's a myth that shows up all the time.
Thanks, Shalini. I think now I'd like us to think about or answer this question of if a student is torn between STEM and humanities at this point of their juncture, because it is a very common one. It's something I also had to encounter. I mean, 3 or 4 of us had encountered this question at some point.
I was not torn. Let me just set the record straight. I was very clear about it.
Okay, Shalini was not torn. It was just me and maybe Tarun to some capacity.
I was actually not torn in the other direction. I was very sure I wanted to try.
Okay, so clearly none of you were torn except me.
This is not a relevant question, Vinay.
But if we did
Sorry,
have
Vinay.
this hypothesis,
Sorry.
I will accept that I was the only one who was torn between this choice. So if you did have to meet this hypothetical Vinay 10, 12 years ago and tell him if he should pick up humanities or the STEM field, what would you say are the merits of doing them? And what are reasons to pick up the humanities over STEM, or how would you approach that question? It's a fairly interesting one in our world where computer science degree for the first time in history, in the recent history, is not the most in-demand job because there is a surplus of computer engineers. It's not the most in-demand role. So it is an interesting time to have this speculative question, I think.
I mean, it's a slightly difficult question to answer because I think it really depends on the specific interests that are motivating this kind of confusion, right? I mean, I think the one thing that I would say is that if the reason people are torn is that they think that, look, I have all these interests in the humanities, I'm really interested in history, or I really like reading literature, but I feel like if I want to have a good job, I need to take science thing. It's irresponsible of me to just indulge my interests by studying history or English or something. I think that is maybe something where I think that is maybe not a good reason to be torn, right? That there are, as we've been talking about, a number of different career opportunities available to you even after you do a humanities degree. And I think for reasons that you were talking about, it's going to become potentially even a larger number when increasingly the kind of USP of human beings is being able to perform the kinds of skills that are inculcated in the humanities as opposed to maybe some of the more technical disciplines. So if that is the reason why a person is torn, is that they're attracted to the humanities, but they feel that there's some kind of a responsibility involved in studying that, I think I would want to say that, okay, that is really not perhaps the best understanding of the way that the kinds of things that the humanities trains you for, right? Don't just think of it as indulging a hobby, right? I really like reading or I really like history. Think of it as also preparing yourself to approach the world in a way that is extremely useful for a variety of different professions and a variety of different reasons. So yeah, but beyond that, I think there's also very good reasons to do science if you have different interests. So I wouldn't want to maybe argue in general that someone who's torn between them should always pick the humanities over science. It would depend on your particular interests. Yeah.
Samir or Shalini, any thoughts?
Okay, so I think the question comes from this kind of perspective where, especially in India, I think there is a lot of emphasis on picking certain disciplines, when you're in school, and from parents to teachers to, peers, everybody is responsible, I think, in putting pressure on students to figure it out early and figure it out in a certain direction. The ideal case scenario would be that you don't have to choose, because um, like I said, for history, for instance, the kinds of career opportunities that you have are so diverse that you could have done them with a history degree and you could have done them without a history degree, actually. And the trouble is that unfortunately we are in a system where students are expected to choose early that they want to do science or commerce or the humanities. I mean, it's very interesting that commerce is not even in this conversation, right? When I was in school, that was the third major stream. And in fact, that was the most populous of the three streams, right? And we're not talking about those disciplines at all here. In any case, I think let's assume that the student has been empowered to choose for themselves and is not being forced. And so here we're not just trying to convince students, and we're trying to convince parents too that let your kids do what they want, right? Let's assume that the parents are supportive and they want their kids to be happy in the future, and not just follow guidance from on high. Then I think it's there are a couple of things. If what interests you, and you do the research a little bit in terms of the kinds of questions we've been answering here, right? What are the prospects? What kinds of things do you get to study? What else can you study alongside? That will give you a good kind of secure understanding of whether to do this or not do this, whether it's the sciences or the humanities, right? So do a little bit of research, I think, going in. Then you will, at least your reasons will be clear to you, which is important, I think. We shouldn't really make it sound like a either or kind of situation, because in places like Azim Premji University, you can take a minor. What Tarun described as his trajectory was physics with philosophy as a minor, right? That's a possibility too. And I think that's the benefit of being in a place like this, which is that it allows you to combine the humanities with the sciences in these interesting ways. So you don't have to choose at all. Do the sciences, right? You still have a path into the humanities. And on the other hand, if you feel like this is really where your happiness lies, right? I think it's also a question of what we are prioritizing. Is it a big fat paycheck, right? I'm not saying you can't make money in the humanities. You definitely can, right? But if that is the anxiety, then there is a very high likelihood that you will be guided towards making choices like doing something in commerce disciplines or in the sciences. And you'll be worried about taking something in the humanities. But if the quality of your life, and a thinking life, right? A life of exploration and a kind of constant widening of horizons is what you're seeking, and you are willing to go on this ride, as opposed to having your entire career chalked out for you from the moment you enter into the field of higher education, then I'd say go for the humanities, right? You have so much more to gain from it, including, like, I mean, think about it. When I teach common curriculum courses, especially to students who are from the sciences, very often they have no idea of what is the history of science, right? How do oops, I think I have gone off. Oh, there I am. How did the common sense that is taught to you in textbooks, how did it come to be that way, right? And I think that it actually, when you go into those kinds of areas, it's like being you're like Alice in Wonderland, right? It's endlessly fascinating, and I think if that's the kind of life you want for you in the future, go for it.
Shalini?
I mean, nothing to add really. I'm sort of with Tarun on this, which is that, whatever you choose it for yourself, for how you're imagining your future, how you enjoy learning, not for, yeah, not because you feel you're obliged to study certain things. So
Thanks, Shalini. Thanks, everybody, for these remarks and comments and thoughts as well, right? I think it is an important juncture when you're at 18 and you're still not sure of what to pursue as a career or a path, and you're still too young to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life. It is a lot of pressure. And I understand the passion for literature or history or even philosophy, but also this financial instability and security and wondering, will this even survive? Do research, find out more. What have people done after this? And there's a lot of information available, and there are enough avenues that we do offer where you can come have conversations with us. The open house, which you'll hear about later, we are very happy to have these conversations and tell you what are possibilities and potentials with these careers, right? Because all the skills our programs offer still open you up to be a researcher at Google for you. What? Because large language models still need somebody who understands language, who understands how people think. These are still potentials and avenues open for you. If you want a job at Google or any Apple, it can still happen with the humanities degrees. These are not things that shut as doors. It's just to understand what is it that you're passionate about and how you'd like to approach it as a subject, as a career, as a passion or an interest. It is to think through all of these things, and we're very happy to have those conversations with you and imagine them from here. Um, I think at this point, we are in the last 5 minutes and we haven't really gotten any questions and comments. So I think we can do one of the fun questions that I had for you put up. If everybody is not too worried. I think I want to start with Shalini's question, which I thought was extremely fascinating, was if why do you say anything can be a text, and could you study a potted plant as a text? Because I think that question really needs to be answered since we have the time.
Uh, uh, well, I'm sorry I put that in, but I will say we start with the caveat. Depending on which literary scholar, when I ask this question to, the answers would probably be violently different. But I will say it would little bit depend on how you wanted to study the potted plant, what questions you were asking of it, what kind of investigation are you doing into that potted plant. If you are thinking about the potted plant as a biological alive being, then the answer is it's not a literary text and you cannot study it. Not in a literature classroom. You are better off doing botany. But Right, so that's one kind of answer. The other kind of answer is to start thinking about what we mean when we call something a literary text, right? If you're a real purist, you're saying it's a literary text. If it's a textual form, which is to say it's composed of languages, words, things like that. From that point of view, a potted plant it's a no-go, right? There are no words involved. That potted plant is not a literary creation. You're throwing it out. But if you're opening out your conception of what a text is and you're saying, okay, but maybe we're also thinking about other kinds of meaning that we make, right? Cultural texts, cultural meanings, then there is a slight possibility that you could, for instance, think about, okay, did, for instance, COVID mean that a lot more people started writing nature poetry about potted plants because it was the only nature they met? Right? We all spent 2 years locked up in our apartments. The only nature we met was the potted plant in our balcony. So all the nature poets are now writing poetry to that one little anthurium on their balcony sill. Right? So you could maybe, in that sense, think of it as a cultural text. But yeah.
Thanks, Shalini. Tarun and Samira, do you want to take a dig at the potted plant as a text?
Yeah. So look, I don't know specifically about the potted plant, but I think it is when I think this is what Shalini was also indicating that in some sense human beings live in a sea of symbols, right? That we are a fundamentally symbolic species. We are surrounded by things which might seem like they're inanimate, but they're still imbued with meaning for us, right? Anything which is imbued in meaning is in some sense a text, right? Reading a text is about interpreting meanings, understanding what a symbol is telling us. And a potted plant can very well symbolize all kinds of things, right? When it's sitting in an office, it might symbolize a certain kind of corporate culture. When you have it in your home, it might symbolize a certain kind of aesthetic sensibility you have. And so it's saying something, it's meaning something. The reason you put that plant into a pot is because it means something to you, right? And so
Or the
to
pot
think
means
about
something to you.
the pot, yeah. And so to think about the world as suffused with meaning, and in some sense that makes, and this is what the humanities to a large extent are interested in, right? Is studying the world of meaning. And that isn't just the world of literal text, right? It's the world of symbols that surround us, and that includes everything we create and also things we don't create, like the natural world has meaning to us. So all of that can
Yeah.
be studied potentially as a text.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tarun. Samira, do you want to take a
Do you
take?
want me to take a shot at the potted plant as well?
If you
I'm
want to, otherwise,
notorious for
then
killing potted plants, I have to admit. So, if anything, I feel like I should get into a conversation with my potted plants, offer them some empathy and support, and tell it some sweet stories, and maybe they'll be kinder and flourish more. But I think, in as far as approaching text is concerned, and as perhaps it is a skill that of the skills that we were discussing in terms of what is its use value outside. And I think for history, one of the things that we keep trying to get our students to understand is that they do understand eventually at the end of the first semester that historians require primary sources to be able to say something about the past, right? But how we read our primary sources, right? How do we actually interpret them, say something about the past using those sources, right? How we read not just texts but objects, right? As Tarun was saying, and find meaning in them, but find meaning that is contextually defined. Not just my own interpretation of what this is, but an interpretation that would hold good for the people that we're actually studying, which is a different society in a different time and perhaps even in a different part of the world. Those are difficult skills which you pick up by practice, and when you learn to do that, actually you realize that the world is so complex, and your ability to be able to think complex thoughts and be able to think in terms of nuance, right? As opposed to black and white understandings of even contemporary issues. It goes, it expands significantly. I have to say this, so it's the reading, is not a bland skill at all. It is difficult work, it takes a lot of effort, and but the rewards are amazing. And the rewards are not just disciplinarily confined. The rewards are such that once you read a text in a certain way, you go back and watch everyday cinema, things that have just been released, a new movie, you go and watch it, you don't see it the same way. Suddenly the world has opened itself up in so many more colors, that your life is that much more enriched, right? And so Shalini's funny question, I have to say, because I kept thinking about the poor potted plant. The word potted plant makes it seem like such a sorry object, right? But there's a lot more, and this is the point that Tarun was making. When you start to dig, right, it is an endlessly productive exercise of exploration.
yeah. Uh, Thank you, Samira. I think we have a couple of questions on the comments, and I think if we could take them as rapid fire questions with quick answers, that would be great. The first one is: do our courses connect the subject matter to current affairs in any capacity?
So I'll say, yeah, the PPE program is very much focused on applying skills to current affairs, right? I mean, part of the aim of the program is to think about the current social, political, cultural landscape, not just the current landscape, also past landscapes, but yeah, we constantly bring up contemporary issues in our program and use the tools of philosophy, economics, and social studies to examine those problems. So yeah, certainly contemporary issues are a big part of our program.
I think for history too, one of the things that helps us in connecting what we teach with the students is to actually draw their attention to things that are happening in the present world and things that they're more familiar with as individuals or just as modern Indians, so to speak, and then see the kind of resonances that there are between what is happening today and what has happened before, right? It's also a way of making sense of the present using these tools that historians have used to talk about the past. So you understand the present better. The flow of knowledge, in a sense, goes both ways.
Shalini?
Yeah, also yes, I would say. And I think with an English course, it flows both ways, right? So on the one hand, you're using what you know from the past to make sense of the present, but on the other hand, you're also using what you know in the present. For instance, just earlier this week, we were talking about what does the word author mean, right? How has the meaning changed over centuries? And we were sort of talking about contemporary authors and the kind of social role they take as compared to someone even 30 years earlier. So yeah, so I think that conversation between the current and the past is always ongoing.
Uh, to just also add to that, I think even with advancement in newer technologies and understanding the world, for example, the new archaeological site at Kilidi has just enhanced and opened up a lot of questions in how we think of history, what we understand about civilization, or even a few years ago when the few temples that surfaced in Mahabalipuram after the tsunami, it opened up a whole box of questions for us, right, to re-examine things. Or at the University of Hyderabad when they discovered that there is an ancient archaeological site and how that opened up
Yeah.
questions. And even when we look at today how the word heartbreak or ice cube was framed by Shakespeare for the first time, and how that meaning has changed over the years, there are ways of you can looking at the past and present and making connections, and it's done very actively in the classroom and very intentionally. There is one
Can I add
question.
one more thing,
Yes.
Vinay, very quickly? Is that apart from the core courses, the majors themselves, the common curriculum that we offer is a really important site in through which the contemporary is understood. Especially the contemporary, if the Indian context is something that we want our students, irrespective of the discipline that they are in, to have a really good sense of, and hopefully do something in the future that is consequential to the society that we live in.
For anybody who wants to know more about the common curriculum, there's a link in the comments that you can open up from the university to read more about the program. To Tarun, there's a very question from somebody saying, this might sound stupid, but is philosophy as a course really worth taking because I'm interested in it? I think while you did explain it for quite a bit for the last hour, but if you could give them a quick response.
Maybe I'll give a kind of annoying philosophical answer, which is that it really depends on what you mean by is it worth it. Right, but let me say this. Like, okay, so one understanding of when you say is it worth it is that is it going to be kind of something rewarding that will contribute to your life? And here I am a biased person to ask this question to. I've done philosophy now for the majority of my life. And I find it endlessly rewarding. I was interested in it when I first started it, and my interest in it has only grown ever since then. So I think in terms of just enriching your life, if you already find you have an interest in the kinds of questions philosophy asks, I think that there's every possibility that you will find it an extremely rewarding field of study. But if you mean worth it in a more kind of immediate sense of, will I be able to do something after I graduate? I think we talked about that a little bit more. So one thing to keep in mind is that in our university, A, philosophy is specifically taught as a set of transferable skills. B, it is taught in combination with other disciplines as part of the PPE major, philosophy and economics, which tie the skills in philosophy to other kinds of knowledge and skills that are, I think, fairly in demand in the market. And three, I think you want to think of your education here at Aziplev University as not just your major, but also the minor that you take along with it, and also the occupational minor, which is something that you take, which is an other minor that you take, which is specifically preparing you for the job market. And so the idea is that you want to think about how the combination of those three things is going to be, in some sense, worth it for you, both in terms of career prospects and in terms of directing you towards what you're interested in. And I think there's a number of different ways you can combine philosophy with, say, if you're interested in learning more about working on environmental policy, you can combine PPE with environmental studies. If you're interested in technological ethics, you can combine PPE with information sciences. So I think it's also worth it in terms of the options open to you for the future.
Thanks, Tarun. Thank you, Samira and Shalini. I think this was a really interesting conversation, if I can say that myself. But yeah, I think we should take this conversation forward. And I'd thank you all for joining us and being part of this. And I'd like to hand the conversation to Pratiti for closing notes.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful conversation. I feel like I learned so much about our own programs through this conversation. For everyone else, we have many more interactions coming up over the next couple of months. We have a session tomorrow evening on support structures at the university. Do try to join that session if you're interested in how we make your life at campus more fulfilling in some way. Our Office of Inclusion, the Academic Resource Center, and the Mental Health Support Team will all be at that session. We have a campus day happening in November. You'll receive information over email for that. Please register, come visit us in person. We'd love to see all of you at campus. Thank you so much again. We went a little over time. I think that is testament to how interesting the conversation ended up being. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Pratiti. Thanks, Vinay.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah.